The sun rose over Nairobi, casting golden light across the iconic dome of the Pan-African Leadership Summit. Inside, the air was tense. Dignitaries, journalists, and political elites gathered beneath soaring arches, their conversations hushed but urgent. At the center of it all stood William Ruto, a seasoned politician whose influence spanned decades, and whose decisions had long polarized the African public. Known for his sharp rhetoric and shadowy deals, Ruto adjusted his expensive suit and reviewed his pre-written remarks. His name carried authority, but also controversy. Rumors swirled that he would use the stage not to uplift the continent, but to issue a veiled threat to those who dared challenge the established order. In hushed corners of the summit, whispers echoed. Some claimed that Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had been warned not to speak. Others speculated that legal advisors were preparing a formal complaint against him, accusing him of destabilizing international harmony by promoting a new economic agenda that excluded Western partnerships. For months, there had been subtle but persistent efforts to discredit Traoré's leadership, labeling him a radical, even a danger to continental security. Some called him divisive. Others, dangerous. But Traoré, seated quietly in the back of the chamber, was unmoved. Dressed in a modest tan uniform, he radiated a calm intensity. He watched every move, every word exchanged on stage. Though he had not spoken yet, his very presence sparked unease among the old guard. For Traoré represented something they feared, a new Africa. One that was no longer begging for aid or validation from former colonizers. One that envisioned a future rooted in self-reliance, dignity, and sovereign innovation. He had no entourage, no fanfare, only silence and unwavering focus. His silence, however, was not submission. It was strategy. On the opposite end of the room, Amina Diallo, a sharp Senegalese journalist known for exposing political hypocrisy, scribbled furiously in her notebook. She knew this would be more than a summit, it would be a turning point. She had been following Traoré for months, tracking how he had defied foreign economic pressures, rejected IMF debt traps, and proposed a revolutionary concept, New African Money. A financial framework built by Africans, for Africans, outside of colonial currencies, outside of manipulation. Nearby, Kwame Nkrumah Jr., a Ghanaian student activist with fire in his voice and conviction in his heart, sat on the edge of his seat. To him, Traoré was more than a leader. He was a symbol. A living rebuke to decades of betrayal. Today, he hoped, he prayed, that the captain would speak. The last to arrive was Zara Mwangi, a Kenyan diplomat torn between tradition and transformation. Her government had long walked a tightrope between Western alliances and Pan-African ideals. She remained neutral on paper, but inside, her nerves betrayed her. She could sense the weight of the moment building. As Ruto finally took the podium, the audience murmured with expectation. His voice rang out, polished and rehearsed. At first, he praised Africa's recent economic gains. But it didn't take long for his tone to shift. He warned against unrealistic revolutions and populist disruptions. Then came the line that cut through the room like a blade. The people must learn discipline before demanding independence. The chamber froze. Several attendees crossed their arms. Others whispered indignantly. Traoré, however, did not flinch. His gaze narrowed, not in anger, but in preparation. Amina turned up her recorder. Kwame clenched his fists. And then, without protocol, without announcement, Ibrahim Traoré rose. He walked slowly to the front of the room. The air seemed to still. No, he said, his voice steady. The people must first unlearn obedience to chains disguised as guidance. A collective breath was drawn. Traoré stood not with hostility, but with unshakable confidence. He spoke of new African money, a currency of integrity, dignity, and cooperation, not printed in Paris, not dictated by Washington. He spoke of African unity, not as a slogan but as a living, breathing struggle. He spoke of self-reliance, not as isolation, but as liberation from dependency. We cannot build a free continent, he said, while borrowing the blueprints of our colonizers. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in realization. Even Zara, once reserved, stood and applauded. Amina's hands shook as she wrote. Kwame's eyes filled with tears. For in that moment, they weren't just witnessing a speech, they were witnessing a rupture in history. Traore did not insult R.u.to. He didn't need to. His words were not fire, they were truth. A truth too long silenced, now spoken in the heart of Africa. R.u.to sat down without rebuttal. Later that evening, headlines would scramble to capture the seismic shift that had just occurred. But none would quite succeed. Because what had happened was more than politics. It was prophecy. A new chapter had begun, and its author was Captainibrahim Traore. Africa, once dismissed, had found its voice. And it spoke in Burkina. We must learn to follow the rules, declared William R.u.to, his voice cold and deliberate, slicing through the silence like a blade across water. We cannot move forward if we continue to be ruled by emotion and a lack of discipline. The words echoed across the hall like a slap. What began as murmurs quickly erupted into boos, especially from the younger delegates. Many interpreted his statement as a veiled insult directed at the youth, the very ones who had been fighting on the front lines of poverty, protest, and policy reform. Among them stood Kwame, a student leader from Ghana. He rose to his feet, rage painted across his face. "How dare you call our people undisciplined?" he shouted. "We are the ones who carry this continent on our backs." Security began moving toward him, ready to escort him out. But just as tension hit its peak, a voice cut through it all, calm, steady, and commanding. "Let him speak." It was Ibrahim Traoré. With quiet power, Traoré stood and began walking, each step deliberate, each moment drawing the eyes of the entire assembly. He approached the podium, standing side by side with R.u.to. The contrast between the two men was impossible to ignore. R.u.to embodied the old guard, polished, calculating, and tethered to the status quo. Traoré, by contrast, radiated something different, resolve rooted in struggle, and a fire born not from ego, but purpose. With composure, Traoré addressed him directly. "Mr. R.u.to," he began, "your words leave me no choice but to ask, do you serve the people or the power?" A heavy silence fell. All eyes turned to them. Amina Diallo, seated front row with her recorder running, scribbled furiously into her notebook. She knew, instinctively, that this exchange would redefine the summit. It was no longer a meeting of elites. It was a reckoning. Zara Mwangi, visibly nervous, leaned forward, whispering to her aides, hoping to de-escalate the situation. She urged that both men step aside for a private conversation. But Traoré was unwavering. "No. If we are to debate Africa's future, let it be in the open. Let the people hear the truth." The audience erupted in applause. R.u.to's expression twisted into discomfort. It was clear he was unprepared for such a public confrontation, especially one where the crowd wasn't on his side. But before he could retreat, Kwame spoke again, this time more measured, yet piercing. "We're tired of pretending corruption is just part of the system," he said. "We've watched elites siphon billions while our schools crumble and our hospitals collapse. Discipline without dignity is just submission. And we will no longer submit." Again, applause thundered through the chamber. This was no longer a political disagreement. It had become a generational clash, a cultural shift unfolding live. Zara tried once more to mediate. You both make points worth considering, she said gently. But perhaps it's time to bridge visions, for the good of all Africa. But her words fell like pebbles into a rising storm. R.u.to, clearly cornered, lashed back with statistics and models. Discipline builds nations, he argued, citing Asian economies that rose under authoritarian rule. We need structure, not slogans. His logic was technical, precise, but cold. His words reduced African people to metrics in spreadsheets. Traore responded without raising his voice. That alone made the room lean in. The problem, he said, is not discipline. It's who writes the rules, and who benefits from them. Africa cannot be built on spreadsheets crafted in foreign boardrooms. We must write our own codes. Create our own systems. Define our own worth. A long silence. Then, a wave of applause, stronger this time. You speak of structure, Traore continued, but what is a structure without a soul? We are not numbers. We are nations. Our future lies not in mimicking other powers, but in reclaiming our own. New African money, born from our soil, backed by our people, and immune to foreign manipulation, that is the structure I propose. Murmurs turned into cheers. African unity, he declared, does not begin with treaties written by outsiders. It begins with trust, trade, and truth between ourselves. And then came the words that sparked the movement. Self-reliance is not isolation. It is resistance. It is the refusal to kneel. The audience was no longer listening, they were rising. Standing, clapping, chanting his name. Even the journalists stopped writing and simply watched, stunned. Traore turned slightly, looking at R.u.to not with contempt, but clarity. This is not a war of generations, Mr. R.u.to. This is a rebirth. Amina knew then, with every fiber of her being, that history had shifted. The summit had been planned as a diplomatic formality, but what it had become was something revolutionary. The clash had ended, not with defeat, but with awakening. Across the room, young voices chanted in rhythm, Africa for Africans. Dignity for all. And in that moment, the old silence cracked, and a new continent began to speak. These practices, Kwame declared, his voice resolute, only continue the cycles of poverty and inequality. His words cut through the chamber like lightning, igniting another wave of thunderous applause. Around him, the younger generation nodded fiercely, many standing in solidarity. Amina Diallo sat frozen for a moment, then scribbled rapidly into her notebook. She knew this wasn't just politics anymore. This was history happening in real time, an open rift between the past and the future. It was symbolic. It was seismic. Meanwhile, Zara Mwangi did what she could to hold the center. You both have valid points, she said with gentle urgency, attempting to soften the atmosphere. What matters now is how we bridge your visions, for the good of all our people. But her appeal landed in a room too charged to absorb compromise. The tension had risen beyond mediation. All eyes shifted again to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He stood quietly, calculating each breath. He knew this was no longer about winning a debate. It was about igniting something greater, change, truth, and the kind of leadership that would echo for generations. His gaze swept across the crowd, landing on the anxious, determined, hopeful faces of young Africans watching him. He knew they were not waiting for a politician. They were waiting for a symbol. Traore took a deep breath and let silence settle over the room. The weight of it was immense, every breath held. Then, he stepped forward again, eyes locked on his rival. Mr. R.u.to, he said, voice steady but commanding, I did not come here to humiliate you or to discredit your work. I came to ask a question. He paused, letting the moment stretch. What legacy do you wish to leave for those who come after us? The room fell completely still. It was not an attack. It was a challenge, a moral one. And it hit like thunder. R.u.to faltered. His confident posture softened. His lips parted as if to answer, but he hesitated. A storm brewed behind his eyes, and for the first time that day, he seemed human. I've always believed my duty was to ensure stability, he finally said. But his voice was lower now, as though weighted with a realization he hadn't wanted to confront. Even if that meant making unpopular decisions. Amina's pen scratched frantically against the page. She recognized the shift in tone, the moment a powerful man questioned his own convictions. Before anyone else could respond, Kwame stood again, voice bold and unyielding. Stability without justice, he said, is just oppression in disguise. He pointed directly at R.u.to, his words now ringing with urgency. We've heard enough speeches. Enough empty promises. We want action. We want a future we can believe in. The audience roared with agreement. Even some of R.u.to's longtime allies shifted in their seats, suddenly unsure of where their loyalties should lie. Zara stood once more, trying to restore order, but her voice was drowned by the momentum. Then, without warning, Amina stood. I have something the people deserve to hear, she announced. Her voice didn't tremble. She revealed that new documents, just received, contained evidence of financial irregularities involving R.u.to's office. The room gasped. Cameras turned. Reporters scrambled. But what came next surprised them all. R.u.to did not deny the accusations. Instead, he lowered his head, and in a voice barely above a whisper, said, Perhaps I have lost sight of what truly matters. Silence again. He looked at Traore, eyes no longer full of pride, but of regret. Maybe I strayed from the path, he confessed. Maybe I forgot that leadership is not about control, but about service. The room shifted. The tension broke. And then, in an act that no one had anticipated, Traore extended his hand. We all make mistakes, he said. But what defines a true leader is his willingness to learn from them. That gesture, a single open hand, changed everything. The audience erupted. Not just in applause, but in hope. Zara whispered to herself, barely audible over the cheers, this is what real leadership looks like. That moment didn't erase the past. But it created a bridge. It marked a turning point, not just between two men, but across a continent hungry for a future it could believe in. In the days that followed, the summit's narrative was rewritten by the people, not by press releases. Ibrahim Traoré's message spread like wildfire. His vision of new African money, detached from colonial currencies, took root in academic circles, youth movements, and rural cooperatives. His call for African unity, not just through institutions, but through mutual respect and dignity, began to shape new alliances. And most importantly, his insistence on self-reliance, not as isolationism, but as empowerment, became the anthem of a generation. Because that day, Traore didn't just defeat an opponent. He inspired a continent. And Africa, for the first time in a long time, felt like it belonged to itself again. The energy in the room shifted. Where once there had been confrontation, now there was collaboration. The battle lines drawn by ideology dissolved into a shared desire to build something greater. Still visibly shaken but profoundly moved, William R.u.to extended his gratitude to Ibrahim Traoré, not just for the gesture of forgiveness, but for the clarity it had brought. Thank you, he said, voice steady but humble. Let us correct the mistakes of the past, together. The summit, which had begun as a fierce ideological battleground, transformed into a platform of reconciliation. Mutual respect replaced old rivalries. No one in the room would forget what they had witnessed. It wasn't just a turning point in politics, it was a shift in African consciousness. In the days that followed, the summit was hailed across the continent and beyond as a historic milestone. What had started as a volatile clash ended in an unprecedented pledge, a joint commitment between Traore and R.u.to to fight corruption, champion education, and invest in social inclusion. They launched several collaborative initiatives, focusing on literacy, clean water access, and transparent governance. For the first time in years, headlines from Africa weren't about crisis, but hope. International media praised the moment as a rare but powerful example of political reconciliation, where two opposing visions found a way to coexist for the greater good. It was a living testament to the fact that ideological differences can be overcome, not through dominance, but dialogue. Amina Diallo's reporting captured it all. Her feature series, The Bridge We Built, chronicled the summit with unflinching honesty, highlighting both the painful confrontations and the moments of healing. Her interviews with both Traore and R.u.to revealed a depth of introspection rarely seen in modern leaders. She asked hard questions. They gave honest answers. Her work didn't just tell a story, it sparked conversations across universities, newsrooms, and households across the continent. Amina became a household name. International outlets praised her for showing that journalism isn't just a mirror, it can be a torchlight, illuminating paths toward unity. For Kwame, the summit was a catalyst. His voice, once limited to student circles, now echoed across the continent. Using the story of Traore and R.u.to as a blueprint, he launched a campaign titled Dialogue First, organizing marches, debates, and forums in cities from Accra to Nairobi. He challenged young people to rethink protest. Not as resistance alone, but as transformation through engagement. His movement gained traction fast. Students, workers, and even moderate politicians rallied to his message. Change is possible, Kwame said in one rally, and we now have proof. Zara Mwangi, once the quiet mediator, rose to international prominence. Her role in de-escalating the summit and advocating for shared ground earned her respect from global diplomats. She was invited to speak at conferences in Geneva, Addis Ababa, and New York, sharing strategies for building trust between opposing powers. Zara didn't see herself as extraordinary. But her method, listening first, leading second, became a model for a new generation of peacebuilders. Her message was simple: when we listen with humility, we don't just avoid war, we plant peace. As for Ibrahim Traoré and William R.u.to, they didn't become friends. But they became unlikely allies. Their private conversations after the summit revealed something deeper than political rivalry, a shared vision, born from different paths but aimed toward the same horizon. They realized that, despite generational and ideological divides, they both dreamed of an Africa that could stand on its own terms. Together, they initiated programs focused on new African money, a currency rooted in local wealth, detached from foreign manipulation, and built to empower rather than exploit. They pushed for Pan-African investment systems, supported by intercontinental trade, not foreign loans. Their collaboration sent a clear message: Africa can finance its future. They launched joint education projects, built literacy centers in underserved areas, and improved clean water infrastructure in drought-affected regions. They weren't building empires. They were rebuilding trust. The impact rippled far beyond the summit's walls. In Senegal, Mali, Nigeria, and South Africa, social movements began adopting the principles of D. On as the only path forward, but as one step in a longer, collaborative journey. Universities added the summit to their political science curricula. Documentaries were produced. Even musicians wrote songs about that fateful day when two men chose unity over pride. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. Africa didn't need heroes. It needed humans willing to admit failure, evolve, and build hand in hand. The summit proved that African unity is not a myth, but a mission. That self-reliance is not about isolation, but about reclaiming dignity. That new African money isn't just currency, it's a mindset. And so, the legacy of that confrontation lives on, not in the clash, but in the collaboration that followed. Because in the end, the real victory wasn't spoken from a podium. It was felt in the hearts of those who finally believed Africa could rise together. Months had passed since the historic summit, but its legacy continued to ripple across the continent. It was no longer just a memory, it had become a movement. At a grand ceremony honoring Africa's emerging leaders, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a large audience. The hall was filled with young activists, reformist politicians, and inquisitive journalists from across the continent. As he looked out over the crowd, Traoré reflected not on his own triumph, but on the meaning of what they had all lived through. Real progress, he said calmly, does not always come from individual victories, but from difficult conversations. His words hung in the air, carried by silence and respect. It is only through mutual understanding that we can overcome our deepest challenges. The crowd listened with intent. They knew he was right. Because what had begun as a clash of egos had transformed into a symbol of Pan-African collaboration, proving that the future of the continent depended not on one voice, but the union of many. The ideas debated at the summit had already sparked change. In country after country, social movements had risen, movements not built on rage alone, but on cooperation, shared vision, and long-term strategy. People were starting to believe again. Not in quick revolutions, but in sustainable transformation. Kwame, once a fiery student leader, now led a Pan-African youth network that stretched from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Reflecting on the summit, he admitted that the example of Traore and R.u.to had reshaped how he viewed power. "We don't need to destroy everything to build something new," he said during an interview. "We can reshape what exists. We can reform it. Redirect it." Zara, whose efforts during the summit had brought balance to chaos, had risen even higher. She was appointed chief mediator of a newly formed international organization focused on resolving political conflict. Her approach, rooted in patience, empathy, and strategic diplomacy, had become a model for others. "No one wins when the goal is simply to be right," she said in one of her first public addresses. "But we all win when we choose to understand." Her words echoed in diplomatic circles across the globe. As for William R.u.to, though critics never forgot his past, many began to see him differently, not as a villain, but as a man who found redemption. He began speaking at ethics forums and political conferences, openly discussing his missteps, and more importantly, his transformation. "Admitting our mistakes," he said at one event, "is the first step toward correcting them. And I could only do that because someone gave me a second chance." His honesty resonated most with the youth, those tired of false promises and eager for truth. Meanwhile, Amina Diallo put the finishing touches on her groundbreaking reportage. Her final article, titled "The Future of Africa, A Story of Dialogue," chronicled not only the sparks of conflict between Traore and R.u.to, but the unlikely partnership that followed. "The initial clash," she wrote, "was not the end, but the beginning of something deeper. A model. A lesson. A reminder that dialogue, though imperfect and painful, can heal wounds no decree ever could." Her conclusion was short, but unforgettable. "The future does not belong to those who dominate the present, but to those who build bridges to tomorrow." And she was right. The summit's legacy was not just reconciliation, it was a philosophy of hope, one that echoed across borders and generations. It taught leaders that empathy is not weakness, and that collaboration is not surrender, but strength. In a time of global division and rising authoritarianism, Africa had offered a lesson to the world. Even amidst polarization, there is always room for dialogue. As the African sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over a continent rising with purpose, a new generation of leaders quietly stepped forward. They were not armed with slogans or vengeance. They carried something far more powerful: vision, wisdom, and the courage to speak across the divide. A new chapter was beginning. And this time, it would be written together. The lesson from the summit: dialogue, dignity, and the rise of a new Africa. It began with a misunderstanding, and an insult. At the Grand Pan-African Leadership Summit in Nairobi, what was intended to be a civil debate quickly spiraled into tension. William R.u.to, a seasoned political figure, stood on stage and addressed the audience with a tone that many interpreted as paternalistic. He warned that Africa could not progress without discipline and criticized the youth for being guided by emotion. To some, this was a standard political comment. But to many, particularly young activists who had grown up resisting corruption, inequality, and exploitation, it was a slap in the face. "How dare you call us undisciplined?" shouted Kwame, a passionate young activist. "We are the ones holding this continent up while you compromise it for power." Security moved to silence him. Tension filled the hall. But then, without pomp or protocol, Captainibrahim Traoré stood. He walked calmly to the stage and faced R.u.to, not with anger, but with conviction. In that moment, Traoré did not represent just Burkina Faso. He embodied the hopes of a generation determined to build a future free from colonial shadows and elite betrayal. Traoré's response was not about humiliation. It was about redirection. "Mr. R.u.to," he said calmly, "I do not question your experience. I question your intent. Are you here to serve the people, or to serve power?" That question pierced the room, and history changed course. What makes Ibrahim Traoré remarkable is not just his courage, it's his clarity. He didn't react emotionally to R.u.to's provocation. He responded with purpose. Where others might have escalated the conflict, he reframed it. He shifted the conversation from confrontation to reflection. From ego to responsibility. This is the first and deepest lesson from that day: true leadership is not about dominance, it's about understanding. Traoré led not with force, but with focus. He listened before speaking. And when he did speak, he asked a question, not to win an argument, but to open a door. In a world flooded with political shouting, his silence was revolutionary. But Traoré's vision didn't stop at symbolism. He offered a concrete path forward, an economic revolution rooted in new African money. For decades, African economies have been tethered to foreign currencies, controlled by interests far beyond the continent's borders. From the CFA franc to predatory IMF loans, the financial chains of colonialism still clink beneath the surface of African institutions. Traoré challenged this directly. He called for a currency born on African soil, tied to African resources, and protected by African institutions. He wasn't just talking about paper money. He was talking about economic sovereignty, the right to define value on Africa's own terms. This idea of new African money is radical not because it's impossible, but because it threatens the systems that have profited from Africa's dependence for generations. Traoré knew this. And still, he dared to propose it.